Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Seeds of Liberty podcast, episode 8. You can find us on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Twitter, Facebook, and you can find all of those through theseedsofliberty.com. So today we have Chris Daly, who is a voluntarist, and we're going to be talking about the Constitution. Is it moral, immoral, legitimate, illegitimate, or can it be considered a contract at all? But before we get into that, maybe we'll get into a little bit of Chris's background, how he became a voluntarist. What led you on this path?
So for me, going way back, I was always on the conservative side of things. My parents are Republican, they would say, but I always I didn't want to say I was Republican. I always said conservative. And then, once I got to college, the last few years, I kind of leaning towards libertarian, right, minarchist. I've always been kind of on the minarchist side, but in the past year or so, I stumbled upon a Bitcoin video produced by Stefan Molyneux. So once I got exposed to him, then I really fell down the rabbit hole. And
That's it. It's over. It's over.
so for about a year now, been a voluntarist.
And
Okay.
do you want to live in a cave or shun society or anything? Why do you hate the roads, man?
Dude, fuck the roads. Oh, I used an F. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Dave, I used up your F already.
It's fine.
Only Dave has a limit, but yes, you used it for him. So Dave, you're out of luck for this show.
I will attempt to try not to say the F word. All right.
So we'll give Chris the first shot as why do you think the Constitution, or what are your thoughts on the Constitution? We'll just make it general.
So, as a minarchist that I used to be, and probably some of you used to be, you might think of the Constitution as what actually gives you your rights. It lays it out very clearly. Most of it's not too vague, that you have the right to free speech, the right to bear arms, etc., etc. Last one is states' rights. Problem is, when the government doesn't want to obey what was written out in the Constitution, there's no consequences. They can get away with whatever they want. So, minarchists will advocate for limited government, but really, there's no such thing, because you need somebody to watch the watchers. It's just a piece of paper in the end.
Yeah. That's always been my objection ever since I became a voluntarist about any constitution is who is determining what is constitutional? The government. And if they're the only ones that are allowed to do so, then it doesn't matter what's written on the paper. It doesn't matter what constraints you put on them, because they decide if that's legitimate or not, and they're always going to decide for themselves, because the best thing for a government is to grow itself. It's an entity. You have to look at things from the government's point of view. The bigger the tick is, the more it can feed, and that's, it's never limited itself, right?
Right. And practically that's what happens. We started off in America with the most limited government really in history. And today it's the largest government with the most laws ever in history. So, it's kind of natural, it seems, that the more limited government you start with, the more room it is for that to grow and become the oppressive regime we have today, the American Empire. But that's kind of the practical argument. But you kind of think of, do your rights really come from the Constitution? And, if you need a piece of paper written by 300-year-old dead guys to tell you what's right and what's wrong, your moral compass might be a little bit broken. Maybe.
For sure.
Your rights don't come from a piece of paper. Whether you believe in a creator or not, they still don't come from a piece of paper, right?
They come from God Almighty.
Exactly.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Dave's not kidding.
No, they come from the universe, man. And, we should all just love. Jeremy, any thoughts?
There are certain people that do believe that's where their rights come from, and beyond that being a ludicrous notion, the there's others that do know what the purported purpose of the Constitution was to be, and that was limits on government. It was never designed to grant any rights. It was alleged to be restrictions on what government could do. The Bill of Rights that people point to as that's where their rights come from, or that's where their rights are supposedly protected, that was only put in to appease the anti-federalists at the time, because the anti-federalists were screaming up and down that the centralizing of power was going to be the downfall of this burgeoning society. And they were actually lied to about the true intent of the Constitution, and they railed against it. Most people, if they are knowledgeable enough, have heard of the Federalist Papers. Many haven't even heard of the Anti-Federalist Papers, but there was a group of individuals who wrote pieces to combat everything the Federalists said. They went point for point on them. And they kept warning that this centralized power was going to be a problem, and it was going to turn tyrannical, and wasn't going to take very long. And you only need to look at the notes at the ratifying convention of Virginia to see that, people like Patrick Henry and George Mason were standing up and saying that this, it was pretty much not as it appeared, and it was going to get bad in a hurry. And they flat out lied, and because of that, Virginia only ratified based on the notion that if any powers were usurped by the federal government, that they could terminate the contract, because they believed they were signing into a compact that could be a voluntary compact to centralize the states just for national defense, and certain measures like that. But if it not for those lies, and if not for those guarantees that, yes, of course, if you want to, if this federal government oversteps its bounds, you have every right to leave. If not for those assurances, Virginia and several of the other colonies would have never ratified in the first place. So they already started off on bad footing. And even if you want to believe that the Constitution is a good document, or if you want to believe in the purported purpose, what the history books in school don't tell you is that it started being shredded right away. So even if you go on the premise that it was good intentions, and it was meant to provide as a free society as had ever been known, starting with the Whiskey Rebellion during Washington's, I think it was his second term, he went ahead and led the militias against whiskey farmers who refused to pay a 25% tax after, less than 10, 12 years before they had been fighting against the British over a 3% tax on tea. So right away, this, the savior of the country and the first president, and this guy who is deified by many on both sides of the, so-called aisle.
I know I did for a while.
Yeah, well, most of us did. As Chris mentioned when he started talking about being in that minarchist phase, we did all go through. Well, I think all of us did, at least. I did too, and yeah, I used to think that they were all swell guys, but it started with Washington, and then right after that, you have the Alien and Sedition Acts with Adams. He made it
illegal for you to vibrate air with your mouth or your throat in a negative manner.
Yeah, you couldn't say anything bad about the government. It's like
it's
right
away.
and those things are swept under the rug, and they're not really talked about a lot in the average history course in public education. We've spoken about that before on previous podcasts, about how it's more of an indoctrination system. Yeah, because they leave out some of the most important stuff. They gloss over. You may get a mention of it here or there, but it was starting to be shredded, less than 10 years in, and it really hasn't stopped, which is why, when I found No Treason by Lysander Spooner, it really hit home for me, because here was this guy, this abolitionist in the 1850s and 60s, who put all this together then and made the proclamation that, the paraphrase at the end of that quote is, whether the Constitution be one thing or another, this much is certain: it was either powerless to prevent what happened, or reverse that. It was designed to do this, or it was powerless to stop it. You know, in either case, it's unfit to exist. And it's only gotten worse since then. So even if you want to think that it was designed for good, it's kind of hard to ignore the track record.
I like to think about Larkin's video of "I'm allowed to rob you."
Yes,
I think that's
educational for minarchists.
Yeah, because I think that brings to mind the idea of where do rights come from? Like the rights that we supposedly delegate to politicians. How can you delegate a right that you don't have, right? So none of us have a right to rob or assault, rape, or kill. However, when talking about government, they are these things are done on a daily basis with complete immunity, right? Because they have different names, right? They're called extortion, they're called the war on terror, they're called imprisonment and arrest, right? Kidnapping. So a group of people, not even the majority or it wasn't even unanimous. It was like it was 39 people got together in a closed door meeting and said, "We are the rulers. We have the right to tax the population." And and actually, interestingly enough, in the document itself, I believe so. So it says we have the right to tax, and then I think they can. What was? Oh yeah, in the Declaration of Independence, right? They say they can crush. How does it word it? If a government becomes tyrannical, they have the right to abolish it, right, and establish a new government, something like that. And then just 10 years later, or a little more than 10 years, in the Constitution, right, they say that the government, the federal government, has the power to crush an insurrection, right, quell rebellion by force, right? So not even 2 decades later, it's just destroyed the Declaration of Independence, which essentially is kind of an anarchic document, but the Constitution completely destroys that. A lot
of people don't know that the Bill of Rights wasn't even in the first draft of the Constitution, and that a majority of the states wouldn't sign on to the Constitution until the Bill of Rights was put in.
Yeah.
So like that's how much thought your founding fathers had in there for you.
Yeah, and just so these 39 people, decided for the entire population at the time that this is what we're going to do to you, and we're going to punish you if you resist and disobey. And so it wasn't even a unanimous decision then, and even like talking about Lysander's time, all the people that actually wrote it were already dead. So it can't be applied to everybody because people say it's a social contract. Well, again, you think about what makes a contract legitimate, right? Both parties are presented with the terms of the contract, they understand it, and then they give their signature or make their mark, right, or their stamp of approval, and nobody has done that except the people who actually wrote it.
Right. Government power is derived from the consent of the governed. Well, who consented to this? I mean, if you count the people who signed the Constitution, my name's not on there, right?
Well, exactly. Yeah. That's why Spooner made the point that even if you want to accept that the people at the time believed that those representatives were legitimate, so therefore that generation all had consent, even if you want to grant that, as you said, once they're gone, who's now consenting? All these people have passed on, so nobody else actually gave consent. They were born into the system, and through their parents they gave consent because their parents consented. We've spoken about that briefly before. I mean, that's just insane. That's just saying that just because you were literally placed somewhere due to an accident of birth, you are automatically beholden to all the rules and regulations. The other thing that you said, Danilo, you're talking about the Declaration and how in a short time frame, that was turned around. Well, yeah, that's why there's a book by what's the guy's name? Skousen, Joel Skousen, I think. It's called The 5,000-Year Leap. And I read this when I was a minarchist, and it got me all fired up because I was a hardcore constitutionalist. And it talks about how the Constitution is supposedly this 5,000-year leap in thinking, of governance. because that's where, you know, we have the 5,000 plus years of recorded history of the state. And as you said, this is supposed to be, you know, the most limited, or actually I think Chris used to started saying that it's, you know, supposed to be the most limited one ever created. So
well,
he wrote this.
Just thinking of that, you can think back to the 12 tables in ancient Rome. I mean, that was a big deal.
Yeah.
But that's a long time ago.
Well, exactly. But this is the first, you know, this was supposed to be the 5,000 year leap, and that's the whole basis of this book, and it goes into detail. Well, in actuality, the Declaration, if you take the Declaration at face value, you know, what the words had, what meaning the words had at that time, you know, what the common parlance made those words mean. You know, this is another thing Spooner actually talks about when it comes to quote unquote interpreting these documents. You're not supposed to interpret them. You're supposed to take the words at face value because they use specific words for specific reasons. So if you believe that, the Declaration was actually the 5,000 year leap forward, and the Constitution was actually a regression.
So, how many people do you think know that, you know, North Korea has a constitution and they are a democratic republic? How many people do you think realize that China is a democrat republic?
And they have elections. Yeah.
And they have elections and they have a constitution. I found it really interesting that the new constitution draft for the new live free or die state in the middle of Croatia or whatever, Libertand or whatever, Liberland specifically says in their thing, the Liberland government can only do what is stated in the Constitution. And I don't think I think that's funny because that's not in any other constitution. You know, the big thing like you'll get limited government American constitutionalists on is like, okay, yeah, the Chinese have a constitution, but they can't own guns. We can. I'm like, the government has drones and nukes. You have a pea shooter compared to them. Do you actually think your armament means anything to them?
Yeah, and show me a time in history when words on a piece of paper have prevented, you know, mass murder, genocide, drone strikes,
yeah,
assassinations, occupations, invasions.
They just suspended habeas corpus and a reasonable bail and all this stuff in Baltimore. I don't really want to go off on Baltimore, but it just shows you how easy the government can say we're acting in a case of emergency.
Exactly when it matters most.
The Constitution doesn't matter at all.
Yeah.
Let's just throw that away because we have people to protect. And, you know, the old saying goes, as Benjamin Franklin says, is, you know, if you give up liberty for safety, you deserve neither. And I don't know how any limited government constitutionalists can sit there and say, well, we need the government to provide us safety, and then say, well, what Benjamin Franklin said was he was right. It was like, well, what? So we need a little safety and we need to give up a little freedom? Like, I don't understand. Like, there's nothing in the Constitution that is going to stop the government from what it's doing. Like, 5 things: the EPA, the FDA, the CIA, the DEA, the FBI. None of that's in the Constitution. The government should not be able to make those entities. So, what are you doing about it? What are you going to go run on Capitol Hill and say you're not allowed to do these things? They're going to say, okay, well, guess who's going to die tomorrow night to an accident?
But the Constitution says right here, you can...
Yeah, this piece of paper that has all my rights and I get all my morals from you. This is gonna save me. And then you got a laser dot right here and you're gone. Oh, it was an accident.
So then let me ask you guys that carry your constitutions in your back pocket or in your glove compartment when you get pulled over by a cop. So when you show him, when you show the cop this little booklet, you know that it's useless and worthless and means nothing, but you're hoping that the cop respects it, right?
Yeah, you gotta play by their game a little.
Right? We're playing into the farce of statism, of limited government statism, basically, right?
Oh, absolutely. I can tell, from my own personal experience in trying that back in my minarchist days, Most cops don't even want to see that. I mean, I've even seen situations in courtrooms, especially traffic court here locally. Judges will scream that the Constitution doesn't even matter in their jurisdiction. And most cops don't even seem to realize, at least the ones I've encountered, that they were supposedly required to swear an oath to it. You know, when I had an incident earlier this year in New York City with some MTA cops, I ended up speaking to two NYPD cops afterwards and started asking them questions. And they swore up and down that they never even swore an oath to the Constitution, so nothing that was in their mat pertained to them. You know, that's the prevailing thought now, that it doesn't. They don't even realize what they're supposed to be doing. So if you show them that, if you catch one who would consider himself a constitutionalist, he may take it seriously. But on the whole, a lot of times it's actually more dangerous to try to assert your rights, depending on the situation, depending on where you are, and depending on the cops in your location. Because I've seen some really bad reactions to that.
Well, it's not just cops. You got to think of the military and soldiers too, because the Constitution expressly prohibits the existence of a standing army. Yet every soldier swears to uphold the Constitution. How is that possible? I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah, I think that's why the Marines are part of the Navy.
Yeah, well, they'll extend the limits of their supposed laws as far as they can to keep reaching and reaching and reaching. You know, that's another reason why laws in general, and even the Constitution to a certain extent, there's a lot of vague language, and that's done purposefully. So you can end up later on with latitude to expand that, you know, and even with the, again, going on the premise that it was really designed for a limited government at the start, and even ignoring the first two gaffes, gaffes rather, that I talked about with the Whiskey Rebellion and the Alienist Edition Acts. You know, then you have the Marshall Court that came around, the Supreme Court in the early 1800s, that pretty much rewrote the rule book when it came to judicial review and what they did. And since then, even the judges, even the justices on the Supreme Court, they don't look to the Constitution for what they're supposedly due to decide whether something's unconstitutional or constitutional. They just build upon precedent, starting with the Marshall Court. And, you know, at this point, again, even if you begin with the premise of best intentions, it's been slaughtered so many ways since then. And they are calling the shots and policing themselves, you know, because the only other argument that you hear a lot is the, you know, the branches and the separation of powers. Well, that's just a joke, because they're all paid through the same system of extortion. And
a sort of conflict of interest that would never be upheld in a court.
Well, exactly. Not even in a court, just in the general
private business.
Yeah, in the general public, people would not go for that, because conflict of interest are struck down all the time, because obviously you're going to give yourself preferential treatment.
Yeah, it's the whole meme of we investigated ourselves and we found we did nothing wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's government in a nutshell.
Yeah, so like I said, even if you believe the best at the beginning, it's been downhill since then. And you know, like I said, the agents of the state these days don't even realize what even if they understand that they did swear an oath to it, whether it be the military or the police or any state agent that is supposedly swears an oath. You know, as Chris said, they are completely ignorant to the fact that they're often swearing to things that says that they don't exist or they shouldn't exist.
Yeah, I like Dave was talking about habeas corpus, and I like that idea, because people tend to think that, you know, the Patriot Act and the NDAA are new legislations. Like, you know, this country is going down the tubes. You see what happened with the Patriot Act and the NDAA, our rights are getting taken away. And you're like, well, actually, if you open a history book, you'll find out that every single time of war that has happened, people have been censored and arrested for speaking out against the government during a time of emergency and war. Right? This is nothing new. This is what happens when you concentrate power in a small group of people. Right? It's like Murray Rothbard's quote. Let's just give the government all the power and all the guns, and then tell it limit yourself. Right? There's been no time in history when a government that has supposedly started as a limited government ever stayed limited, right? The purpose of government is to expand and extorts tax cattle until they can support no longer. Then you get the wealth transfer, economic collapse, and revolution, unfortunate violence that occurs because people don't understand that statism is a revolution. We're not progressing anywhere. We're not evolving. We're revolving and continuing to repeat the mistakes of our ancestors.
That's something I hear from monarchists in particular, is that the federal government's supposed to be checked by the states. The states are given power by the 10th Amendment, and they're what's supposed to actually limit the federal government. And the states are really 50 different little experiments going on, and that's like the most ideal way to have a government. And it's like, well, 50 different little oppressive regimes, little gangs, isn't any better than one big one, right? If you're really concerned about limiting authoritarian power like that, you need to get rid of it. Dividing it up into little pieces isn't making it go away.
Well, two things kind of really screwed over state sovereignty to the federal government. One was them changing the the way senators are elected. For a certain period or for a long time, senators were it wasn't an elected position. They were appointed by the state legislator. So you had a little bit more control over who goes to the Senate. They couldn't gerrymander all the districts and stuff to where certain people just can't lose. And then the way they tied the tax money into the roads, into corporate subsidies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If a governor threatens to do something in a juxtaposition to the federal government, they go, okay, well, you're not going to get any road funding for a year. Well, that's political suicide for the governor. So, it's like the legal drinking age was federally set, and Tennessee had it still at 19 years old or 18 years old. And Tennessee wasn't going to balk on the situation until the federal government said, hey, we'll just cut out all your road money. And then Tennessee goes, okay, it's 21, like the next day.
So they do that with education, too, right now.
Well, yeah, they do it with pretty much any federal welfare. Like Alabama, for instance, is a complete welfare state. Like for every $1 they give to the federal government, they get $2 back. So no local politician or the governor of Alabama doesn't even matter. Those are fictitious positions because they receive so much money from the federal government that if the federal government wants them to do whatever they want, they can just say, all right, well, we'll cut the money off. And, those people can't afford to do that because it's their mouth gets slapped away from the government teat, and that's not privy to their ambitions. So the Constitution has been so warped, and so it's almost like they want people to believe that the Constitution is what's being used right now to justify government, but then they can do whatever they want about it, or in opposition to what the Constitution says, and therefore you have no repercussion because you believe that you have no recourse because you believe that the government gets its power from the Constitution that we all accept. And that's just, if you really examine that, if you pull yourself away from your flag waving and your I'm proud to be an American and all this other stuff, and you really look at it with a critical eye, you can see that it's all just a dog and pony show. It's just all bullshit. It's just a freaking dog and pony show used to trick you into believing the lie that government is legitimate and authority is a righteous thing, and you should obey it.
So if the federal government gets its powers granted to it by the states, where do the states get their power from?
Supposedly the people of their state. It's just, well, as you said,
somebody is elected or a group of people vote to create rights that didn't exist before.
Yeah, you can't delegate a right you don't have.
Yeah, it's a microcosm of what happens on the larger federal level. Just like you were saying, cutting it into the 50 pieces doesn't necessarily make it better, because now you just have more of them who run in the same manner. You know, the one thing I would just push back a little bit on, Dave, what you said. I mean, I would agree that those two acts, you know, the what is it, the 16th Amendment that made it a popular vote, and the tax structure have definitely perpetuated the problems of neutering the states of whatever power they allegedly had before that. But it actually goes back beyond that. You know, we discussed it in our episode with Jim Liber Davis, you know, going back as far as the Civil War, or however you want to describe that conflict. That's actually when pretty much the nail was put in the coffin of states' rights, because, you know, as we discussed, the reality is the South just wanted to secede. They just wanted to leave. They didn't want a war. War was forced upon them. And you know, that's also another time, as you were saying, Danilo, habeas corpus gets suspended all the time. Lincoln did it then. He suspended habeas corpus, and they pretty much forced the southern states to the representatives to return, because there was a while where it was actually their seats were vacant, and based on, again, the rules supposedly set up by the Constitution, they didn't have enough members to pass votes at that point. They didn't, you know, there weren't enough people, because the southern representatives left when the South attempted to secede. And that's where a lot of the conspiracy theories and stuff like that come up, about how nothing is you know, the people that are pure constitutionalists believe that it ended that day and that everything since then is illegitimate. But those are the hardcore minarchists that, again, still believe that, you know, government's still necessary and it was just done wrong, so we can do it again, which is funny, because that's the same thing you hear about the arguments against people who try to defend communism and socialism. It just wasn't done right. That's the mantra you hear all the time.
Well, I mean, that goes for almost every idea, though.
Yeah, but, you know, so like I said, that's actually when it started, because when they were forced to come back and those amendments were written, it was designed, they were pretty much forced at threat of more gunpoint to sign off on those amendments and bring the country back together. And that's why, you know, even some constitutionalists will say that, you know, Lincoln destroyed the Republic in order to save the Union. And because before that, it had been known as these United States with a lowercase u. And it was after that it became known as the United States. It was no longer 50, you know, or whatever it was at the time. I forget what was it, 40-something. They were independent entities, which still had their own centralized power, but it was more limited, the powers of the federal government. After that, it became one big blob, and the states, you know, they've lost it in pieces since then, but that was the beginning of nailing the coffin shut, where everything became dependent on surviving as and thriving supposedly as a nation, as opposed to a bunch of individual sovereign states that were just under that collectivized umbrella that supposedly was the whole purpose of the Constitution in the first place.
You know, one interesting argument I hear from some people is, you know, that government it's just us, right? And we're progressing together and we're improving society, like, and you know, when I give the idea that, you know, chain slavery was legal at some point, you know, under the Constitution, and then they say, well, see, it's no longer with us, so we have evolved. Well, if you really want to go back to the Constitution, then you really want to go back to chain slavery, right? Because under the Constitution, it was tolerated and it was allowed and it was enforced. That's the other thing that some people don't want to accept. is that
Slavery is not legitimate without government.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
it doesn't exist.
Today we have, slightly different form of slavery known as, economic slavery, but we still have some servitude and some ties to our political rulers in a way that cannot be severed without significant punishment, right? Imprisonment and or death if you resist. So slavery is inextricably linked to government. It cannot exist. And as we were talking recently, slavery is not an efficient business model. Some I hear this argument also. It's just easy. People did slavery because it was efficient. You just have to subjugate people, feed them, force them to work for you. That's so easy. That's how you make it. But no, that is the most difficult way to to produce products and services. The best and the easiest way is through voluntary transactions, and the cheapest and most efficient way. And it's not through coercion, it's not through violence. That is the most expensive. And those costs can be offset and socialized only through the perverted nature of statism and government.
So I want to ask you guys to something, okay? What would you tell the constitutionalists that might be listening to this? What if you could tell them one thing, what would you tell them, and we're talking about somebody who's raised to believe that this magical document is I don't want to use Sophie Street. This document is supposed to be what's guiding the people of America, and it's what keeps government in check, and is a gift from God, essentially, and it should be held to a higher standard. I mean, it's just words on paper, in my opinion, that mean nothing. But what would you say to them? I'll ask Chris first.
Well, the first thing I would say is, did you actually consent to the Constitution? Right? Were you there when it was written and you put your name on it, or at least verbally consented? Did that ever happen? Well, a lot of people will say, well, I live here, I choose to live here, so that means I consent. I gave my consent. Well, that's not really an argument for an oppressive statist society where, the government can justify themselves based on what's written on a piece of paper. So that doesn't add up.
I would also say you can't give consent for another person as well.
Right. There's nothing you can do. You can't write anything on a piece of paper that gives consent of another person. I mean, they have to give their consent. You can't write their consent out for them. That's impossible. That doesn't work.
That's slavery.
Right. That is slavery. So, with that in mind, you really can't, justify anything just by writing on a piece of paper.
Yeah, you and your buddies agree that this paper is the rule of law. Voila, you got a democracy. Jeremy?
Well, we've previously discussed, the belief in authority, and we've broken that down. And it's if you look at the whole situation logically, and you're using logic consistently, then you'll see the contradictions in the system. And it really, everything falls away. But even for the people that don't want to go that far, what I would say to them, to the minarchists, especially the ones that claim that they're well read on history, and that's why they know that this was a good document and it had legitimacy from the beginning, and it still has legitimacy. I always try to encourage people to dig deeper, because that's how I figured that. I mean, at least that's what worked for me. Like I said, I was a hardcore constitutionalist. I used to carry one in my back pocket at all times. I could recite most of it for a while. When my kids were very first born and first came home, I actually used to read them passages out of it to help them sleep.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I was pretty dedicated.
I used to read it on like a 3 or 4 month basis. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would read it in full to myself at least once a month or once every 2 months.
I mean, if you believe it's legitimate,
Well, yeah, but so
to do.
well, exactly. So, but that's when I started reading further. I was pointed in the direction of a couple of documents that I had never really heard about before. Stuff like I spoke about earlier. The notes from the ratifying convention for Virginia. I believe there's notes from some of the other ones that can still be found, although a lot of them are really hard to come by. But stuff like that. Stuff like I mentioned earlier, the anti-federalist papers. A lot of people haven't read those. Like if you read these other points of view, you can see that not only was consent violated on pretty much every level in general, because again, as we've been discussing, you can't consent for another. You can't, especially the unborn, because that's essentially what you're doing by saying that this document is now upheld in perpetuity. You're giving consent for the yet to be born. Like, that's insane. You can't do that.
Oh, they signed an amniotic fluid, though. You're forgetting that part. On the dotted line, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and for a nugget for you little. For a little nugget for you socialists out there, guess who wrote the Constitution and signed it? The rich white people.
Rich white slave masters.
Oh my God.
Not all of them were, but
I
yeah,
forgot about the slave master thing.
Most.
Well, like I said, though, there's certain documents that you read, and the anti-federalists are a good one, because you can see that, like I said, not only is consent, when you break it down logically, impossibly to be given that way, but even if you want to put that aside, it's still, you see how much objection there was to this. So even if you believe in the notion of consent to the government, when you start reading documents like this, you see that it wasn't as clear cut. There wasn't this massive consent. It literally was those men in a room who were sent there by their states, but the states already had their own, form of centralized power, even at that point, on certain levels. So it still wasn't, they didn't even have the consent of everybody in their own state to be sending these people to be representatives, to then therefore speak for everybody in the entire state. So when you read these documents, and another good ones that I came across that a lot of people haven't read are the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798 and 1799. Madison was one of those ones who wrote the Federalist Papers along with Hamilton and John Jay. But he actually believed that the system went way too far, even beyond what he wrote, because he's considered the father of the Constitution. So if you read documents like the two, those two, the resolutions, you see that Jefferson and Madison were even talking about how things had already started to go too far, and that's why they brought up the idea of nullification way back then. These days it's considered a dirty word, just like secession is. Because it's been demonized by the political class and supposedly wiped out as a it's a non-threat to their system, and people grow up believing that, or even Madison wrote another one, in the report of 1800. Like, all these documents that people are not shown in school, can show even the most hardcore constitutionalists that there was a lot of dissent that has been masked and has been, you've been propagandized to believe pretty much the exact opposite, that there was only maybe a small percentage of people who disagreed. And of course, for them, that's enough because you have the majority, but that gets to the whole issue of democracies and how it doesn't matter how wide the swing is, whether it's 99 to 1 or 50.1 to 49.9. It's still those people outwilling the other, no matter what they want. So, again, consent is impossible in those situations. So that's what I try to encourage these people to do that don't want to examine the authority issue, that the fact that, again, if you study it logically, it is completely illogical. If you really want to believe that this was a good document, then start with reading those things. And then maybe you'll get a better idea of how forced this really was, and how ratification was forced on the states. And that's why, like I said earlier, if anything,
rich, wealthy white men, right?
Well, they were the ones in charge at the time.
Oh, okay. I was just making sure.
Even if you personally agree with the principles outlined in the Constitution, you can't force that on other people. You just can't do that.
You can't delegate a right to someone that you do not have.
Right.
And the right to tax someone, you can't do that yourself.
You can't give consent for all the people who live in your region. You can't give consent for everyone who's alive, and you can't give consent for all of their children for generations going on until infinity, because the Constitution is not limited.
You're right.
There's no termination date. It exists forever.
So Danilo,
expiration date.
Expiration date, yeah.
So Danilo, if you could say one thing to a hardcore constitutionalist to maybe not rustle their jimmies or get them upset, but kind of make them look at this at a different light.
Well, I like to go back to what Chris was saying about if you have to look at a 230-year-old document to assess your own morality and determine right from wrong, then you have a seriously deranged sense of right and wrong, and that reflects on the idea of legality versus morality. And and a lot of people do this. They ask the question, whatever people are doing, is that legal? Is that legal? What that person is doing? And they fail to realize that so many things that were once legal are terrible atrocities that we consider today. Human rights violations, and the Holocaust was legal, and chain slavery was legal, and
what's the saying? The mind of a slave asked if it's legal. The mind of a free man says, "Is this right?"
Who gives
it right, or is it voluntary?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a great topic to get into, because everybody tend to associate, and perhaps this goes back to our government schooling. They associate government as our family, like Uncle Sam. He's just your uncle. He's a family member. Okay, don't disappoint your uncle. And
no relation.
He's our collective uncle. So you always have to please the political rulers. Whatever they scribble, we must obey, right? Because we are government, and if they write it, then we wrote it, so we must obey them. But if we disobey, then we get punished severely. But we are government. That.
Well, that's one of those contradictions that's impossible to avoid, and most statists and even the minarchists will rail against even addressing that problem, because as I pointed out before, there's that Ayn Rand quote, if you find the contradictions don't exist. If you find one, check your premises, because one of them is wrong, and that's a complete contradiction, exactly as you said. Well, if you're the government and the laws, you gave consent for the laws to be written, but they're only applied to you and not to the agents of government, and you can't do the same thing to the agents of government that they can do to you. Isn't there a problem there? And yeah, they'll the mental gymnastics it takes for them to step away from that, because that again, if you want to go beyond the belief in authority, because a lot of people, again, they'll try to sidestep that one, but you just keep taking it down the line and just, well, here's another contradiction. Well, what happens when you run into a contradiction? There's obviously a problem, and it's just littered with that. But that propaganda and the indoctrination that everybody has received for so long has just blinded so many to even wanting to question that. Because again, as you were also saying about the whole, it's basically they think morality can be legislated, and that's an impossible task. You can't. You can't. And anytime you pass an edict that affects some people and not others, or affects certain people in certain ways and certain people, like you all of a sudden lost the supposed equality you were seeking, and somebody will always be negatively affected by that.
Yeah, there ought to be a law for that.
Well, yeah.
So, you've got a constitutionalist. You've started asking these very passive, non-confrontational questions for them to just examine themselves, and they throw their hands up and says, "If you don't like it, you can leave. Move to Somalia. If you don't, if you don't think,
move to Baltimore.
Yeah, if you don't think America is the best country on earth, then you can just frickin' leave.
Move to Detroit. Come on."
So what do you say to that, Chris?
Well, kind of touched on this earlier, but first of all, I was born here, and I didn't consent to be born here. It just kind of happened. Wasn't in the womb, didn't sign a contract. Oh, I'm going to be born in America because that's what I want. No, it doesn't happen.
Yeah. I'd like to be white. I'd like to be born in America and, upper middle class.
Right. So, but on top of that, enforcing any edict comes with the threat of force. That's, short of self-defense, every law that is passed has either a threat of a fine or a threat of jail, and if you resist any of that, you're going to get hurt, right? So,
what is it? Law is an opinion with a gun?
Exactly. Now, you have to justify that, right? And if your justification for that is a piece of paper written by a bunch of dead guys, that doesn't cut it. As we've already explained pretty thoroughly. But yeah, so telling somebody that they should move because of an injustice going on here, it's like saying, well, if there's a bully on the playground and he says to you, well, this is my playground, you don't like it, go to another playground. Well, that's ridiculous, right? He's the bully, right? He's the one in the wrong. But if somehow the government is the one doing the bullying, now you are obligated to leave. That doesn't seem right, does it?
No, because that wouldn't work in any other scenario. It's
right.
the same.
So if you're the bully, you'd probably punch him in the face, right? Now,
even if you were too timid to do that, it still doesn't make him right for doing so. So if it's not right for the bully, it's the same thing with say the mafia. If you were born in a town and as you were growing up, the mafia moved in, or even if they were there beforehand, just because you were born in their location, and they came to you and said, now you have to give us this much money for protection, or we're going to be the ones that hurt you. Like anybody else would see that. Even the most hardcore constitutionalists would usually say, well, of course that's not right, that they're forcing me to be part of their system and telling me that I either have to obey or leave, just because I was born there. Well, that's ridiculous. Well, if you follow the logic, it's the same thing with government. Like Chris was saying, it's, why is it different? Like people really.
Yeah, no one looks at the bully and goes, yeah, that guy, what he's doing is legitimate.
Yeah. If it's
he's got a badge. He's got a badge.
If it's not legitimate in any other scenario, then
that'd be a funny skit. Get a bunch of kids and then get a kid and put a uniform on him with a shiny badge and just have him bully the shit out of all the kids, and then they go, well, he does have the uniform and the badge.
That's a shiny badge.
Yeah. Well, that's what people think. They have that idea in their head, so they must be right. But again, you run into all those contradictions when you think that way. So
yeah, that's a great line. I like that the cop block uses badges do not grant extra rights, which basically ties back to you can't delegate a right you don't have.
Not only do badges not grant extra rights, but pieces of parchment don't either.
Yeah, exactly, and you have to reduce it down to the simplest components. Can I steal from my neighbor? No. Can I tell my friend to steal from my neighbor? No. Can I hire somebody to steal? No. So if a group of us get together, when is it good to steal? Tell me, how many people in the group does it make it suddenly right to steal?
Yeah, and that's Article 1, Section 8 right there. The Congress has the right to lay any levies or taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And enforce their procurement, essentially.
And well, the thing is this: once you change the name, all of a sudden it becomes okay, right? Because you have created a new term, right? These political euphemisms abound in our status society, right? surveillance surveillance it's not spying, it's surveillance. It's not indoctrination, it's public education. It's not mass murder, it's the war on terror, right? It's not kidnapping, it's arrest and imprisonment. So getting past the political euphemisms and seeing reality as it is, the first step is accepting and recognizing reality that we live in, and only then can we make the necessary changes to improve that reality, right?
For
So
sure.
that's what I think a lot of us are trying to do, is just show people what is reality, what is really going on here. Are you really government? You really think those people that come to town and block off 4 streets and have all these armored personnel, and then they disarm everyone around them? You really think you are them? That's you, really?
Right, and this gets into forms of government, and people will say, "Oh, but a republic or a democracy or both is the best form of freedom we've ever had in the world's history." Well, if you look at that clearly, what it is you have a group of people who are in charge, who are given authority in some manner. If they're a king, they're royalty. If they are a republic, they might have a constitution or whatever. If it's a democracy, it's the will of the majority, right? In every scenario, it's a certain group of people or person that is asserting their authority over everyone else. Now, that's statism. In every single form of government, you have a group of people imposing their will on the minority, except for voluntarism, because it's stateless and you don't have that. So people will defend republic saying it's free, they'll defend democracy saying it's free, and it's statism or anarchy. There's no in between. It's a binary thing here.
For sure. You can't just have a little bit of tyranny. Like a little bit of tyranny, it's like being a little pregnant or having like a little cancer. Like when someone says
it's just a little bit of rape, that's it. Just a little.
When someone says they're for limited government,
set off all the comms.
Yeah. When someone says they're for limited government, or they believe in the principles of the Constitution, and we need to get back to the Constitution, or have a Reagan revolution, or whatever the hell that means. But when someone says something like that to me, I'm like, okay, so if you went into the oncologist, which is a cancer doctor for the stupid people out there, if you went into an oncologist and they found a big tumor on your neck, and the oncologist goes, I'm kind of a limited oncologist. I'm only going to cut out 90% of that tumor. What's going to happen to that tumor? Let me pull the audience here. Is it going to grow back, or is it just going to say, I've lost 90% of my mass, I'm going to die?
That's it. I'm dead.
What's going to happen? You have to understand that we, as libertarians, as voluntarists, believe that government is a cancer. It's a blight upon humanity.
And it's not just belief, it's evidence. We talked about earlier, the smallest government in history, the most limited government, turned into what we have today.
Yeah, they nuked innocents in Japan.
Well,
that's just one. That's just one.
Exactly, among the things. But yeah, exactly as you said, Chris, it not only is it now the largest pretty much ever, it's also happened in such a short time frame. Most people who look at that and go, 230 years, that's a pretty good run in the grand scheme of things. 230 years is nothing. And if that's all it took for the supposedly most limited government ever to be destroyed, it's what are you going to get back to if you try to go back to the Constitution? People think that, we can just start over. It led to this. Like I said with that Spooner quote, either whether you believe that it was designed this way, or it was just powerless to stop it. The results are still the same. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what the means were. Where we have the ends is we live under, on a lot of levels, the most oppressive government ever created. And it's not just oppressing us; it's oppressing everybody else around the world.
It's tough when you're talking to people who hear this over and over: limited government, checks and balances. This is the freest country in the world. Well, even if that stuff's all true, you're still not free. You gotta have principles and, morality that's not based on paper.
Oh, for sure. I used to love the Constitution. I used to love George Washington. I used to love the Founding Fathers. I used to read about it constantly, and I thought, man, if I could just go back and meet George Washington and talk to him and tell him, hey, you need to do this to the Constitution. You need to make sure that this is worded this way, so it can't, because this is what it turned into, and even then, I don't think that would fix it.
He would have said, "Did you pay your whiskey tax yet?"
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure yeah, he would. They'd probably kill me and burn me at the stake for being a witch, but people are so stupid. But I used to think that George Washington was quite possibly one of the greatest men that had ever lived, and now I think, I know this is probably heresy for some people hearing this, I think that George Washington may be one of the worst people that ever lived, and Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton and all of pretty much the first 5, 6, 7 presidents, they were all tyrannical. They hated what King George was doing, but I got to be honest, at this point in time, I'm pretty sure I think I'd prefer King George over what we got right now, and that's pretty sad when you're preferring a king over democracy. Because you look at what a king can do, it's still democracy. As I've stated before, a king gets his power from the majority, from people believing that he has the right to rule, but that's one man. That's one man.
It's easier to take down.
Actually, one bullet in the middle of the night fixes that problem.
But interestingly enough, I remember hearing Stefan Mali discuss monarchy and how that's actually much more superior to a democratic republic because it's kind of the idea of the tragedy of the commons, with the democratic republic, that people are elected. And it's not really there, it's difficult to discuss property and government, but in the sense that, with a monarchy, you can say that the country is his, right, for his lifetime until he dies, and he passes it down to his children. And so it is in his best interest, he is incentivized to pass it down in a better state than he had it, right, because he wants to propagate his lineage, right, whereas presidents and prime ministers and anybody that's elected, they don't have such such authority for a long period of time as the monarchs do. So they spend as much money as they can, they do as much damage as they can, and then they leave. Maybe the first term is not necessarily as tyrannical as the second term, since they know that they're, what's that called, lame duck, where they know they can't go back in office, right? So so they don't have as much incentive to take care of things, but not nearly as much as the monarchy. So in a sense, I would agree with Dave that in a twisted sense, the monarchy would be better, just because the tragedy of the commons, because essentially he doesn't feel like he owns the country like a monarch feels like.
How many people did King George lock up for smoking weed? Goose egg. So I know I'm making light of the situation of a kingdom, but honestly, at this point, I think I'd rather prefer a king than a democracy being involved in my life, because when there's a king, all the problems fall on his shoulders. You can point to him and say, that is the problem. We need to fix him. His ass needs to go. But when you had this whole guise
if we have a perfect king, everything's just going to work
out
perfectly, right?
But I'm not making an appeal to I'm not making an appeal to kingdom or anything like that, or any kind of feudal rule. What I'm saying is we're seeing what people trying to control other people. When there's 1,000 heads on the Hydra here, and you can't chop one off because 2 grow, it causes adverse effects. Democracy never fixes the problems that people think it fixes. Constitutions never limit the government the way they think it's going to limit it. Look at China, look at Russia, look at the Ukraine, look at Israel, look at all the Iran probably has a constitution. I don't know that for a fact. I'm sure I could Google search that in 3 seconds and find out, but constitutions are not limiting governments, and getting back to the Constitution is not ever going to happen.
Well, I would push back on one thing, Danilo, you said a little earlier. Um, I think the Bushes, the Kennedys, and now the Clintons would disprove your theory that there's not the the line of kings here. um,
Yeah,
families,
The Roosevelts as well.
yeah, well, yeah, families like that have existed, and they're still around.
True.
But yeah, on the whole, there you do have that difference where the one person keeps passing it on. But the other thing I would say about democracies and how we've all kind of touched on, a lot of people seem to think that's a good thing, and that's what you strive for. There's that quote that I believe it's attributed to Churchill. I believe it's actually been proven to be his, but democracy is the worst form of government except all the others. Well, if the history of democracies is showing you what the best option is, do you really think we're at the best option? Like,
Yeah, it's like, to me, democracy is like a trick that whoever's pulling the strings behind the puppet show at the top has finally tricked people to believe in what, there was revolt against kings, there was revolt against emperors, and those are real problems they had to deal with. And now the emperors and kings have backed off and put puppet shows in front and tricked everyone into believing that those are for the people, that we're the people. Look at Iran. They have the supreme leader of Iran, and then they have a president. That's not just exclusive to Iran. So,
if we call it a president instead of a king, it's much better, right?
They used to call President
improve.
George Washington King George. So,
well, if the king is actually 100 senators, it doesn't seem so bad, right?
Well, yeah, because you can change, you can customize him. You can change a ring finger or, or whatnot. But, let's wrap this up. Danilo, any closing comments on the Constitution?
I would just tell people that ignore ancient dusty documents that are encased in glass. They have no applicability to our present day, and if you did not sign or read a contract and sign it or make your mark, it is not applicable to you in any way. There is no such thing as a social contract. Anything that you learn in your public schooling, you must question, because just given the fact that government schools is funded by stolen funds, taxpayer money, is again a conflict of interest, as we were talking about. Which agenda will they promote? Let's think about this. Will they promote the agenda of Germany? I don't think so. Soviet Union? No, I don't think so. So we have to really think about, as I say, follow the money. Where's the funding coming from? And you will discover what the agenda is and what the propaganda will lead you to believe, right? So I would just say to people, just recognize your own, authority, your own morality, your own free will. That should be your moral compass, right? You should base things off of your own free will. So yeah. What
hey,
about
man.
you, Jared?
Well, I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. The most important thing, I think most constitutionalists or even people that just believe the Constitution was a good idea and still believe that the government either should be held to it or completely erroneously believe that the government is still somehow binding itself by it. Just start reading more. Seek out some of those documents I mentioned earlier. The Anti-Federalist Papers, the notes on the ratifying conventions, the resolutions from Kentucky and Virginia, Madison's Report of 1800, and another important one especially for the hardcore constitutionalists who have not come across it yet. I challenge you to read No Treason by Lysander Spooner, and then come back to me and tell me that you still don't see these blatant contradictions that are impossible to escape. When you really start questioning things, if you really believe that you are the government, as we've touched on, you're gonna have to find a way to explain those contradictions away when you put the whole puzzle together. So You know, that's the best advice I could give people.
Chris?
Yeah, I think Danilo mentioned this earlier, that Larkin Rose video, "I'm Allowed to Rob You." That's he lays it out pretty clearly why I think he says the Constitution is complete bunk that you've been taught your whole life. So go look at that if you haven't seen it.
Hey, man, I learned in my government socialized schools that the Constitution was written by the people and for the people, all right now?
Right. So pretty much the main points that we've already talked about. One, whether you believe in a creator or not, your rights don't come from a piece of paper. And two, even if you consent to all of that personally, you cannot subject other people to what's written on that paper, because that makes you a tyrant. It doesn't matter if you have the authority of a king or the authority of Congress or whatever. It's wrong either way, and you're an authoritarian. So with those two things in mind, you know, any authority derived from a piece of paper just seems ridiculous.
Yeah. The thing I'll say to wrap up what I feel about this whole thing is, can you grant someone a right that you don't have? I know that we've already said that a few times in the show, but that's really an eye opener, and it's really a good way to examine this whole situation. Can you delegate? Can you make, for the stupid people, can you make something that is bad?
This is the politically correct episode.
Yeah.
We're losing subscribers by the minute.
No. Look. So, can you delegate a right that you don't have? Can be dumbed down to, can you make something that is bad good by having someone else do it? And I know that sounds silly, but you can't. So, if you look at the way government is funded, it's funded through taxation. Taxation is a coercive fine or levy placed upon a person or an entity. Coercive means force. We are against force. If you're for force, we don't want you around us. And we're talking about initiatory force. So if you pull back everything I just said, can you delegate a right that you do not have? You do not have the right of taxation. You cannot walk to your neighbor and go, "Hey, you're on the same planet as me. I've deemed that your property is under my rule, and you owe me rent fines or property taxes." They're going to look at you like you're crazy. You can't call someone else and have them come over there on your behalf and do that. That's what the Constitution is. That's what the Constitution does. It gives rights to people that you do not have yourself. That's it. Think about that. Don't just brush off what we're saying and say, "Oh, those guys are lunatics. It'll never happen. This is what we got, and we've got to live with it." That's an appeal to antiquity, as Danilo would love to say. And that doesn't answer the question. It's a scapegoat. It's move to Somalia. You know, it's what about the roads? It doesn't answer the question. You have a contradiction in your head that you have to answer for it to be a sound argument. So I used to be one of the staunch conservative Republican constitutionalists that you could ever meet in your obnoxiously that you could ever meet in your entire life for the 90% of my life, 98% of my life. Well, not that far, but so if I can beat this, as Cal Molinet would say, Leviathan, which I got him on, but this Leviathan that is the Constitution that you believe can run your life and others. If I can beat that, someone who would have buried their head in the sand, someone who would have even feared to think about the Constitution not being legitimate. If I can beat it, so can you. If I can beat that argument in my head, so can you.
Statism is one hell of a drug, isn't it?
Yeah, and so is cognitive dissonance. And that's what happens when you have two conflicting ideas, but one of those ideas you've been indoctrinated and it has been beat into your head your whole life. So, Danilo, I'll pass it to you to wrap up the show. Mic drop, I'm out.
Yeah, I'll just say one last comment on the "I'm allowed to rob you" video. Dave talking about if you say to somebody, you have to give me money because your house falls on my jurisdiction, that person's going to say, well, where'd you get the authority? And you say, hold up a piece of paper right here. It says I'm allowed to rob you. Well, that you just wrote that. All right, hold on. Let me go to Staples. I'm going to make it nice and fancy. All right, there. Now it's fancy. I hereby grant myself the legitimate authority. And what is the difference between that and the Constitution?
And by the way, I forgot to thank so kindly for Chris to come on and talk with us.
Sure, anytime.
Yeah.
Oh, one more thing I want to plug, the Seeds of Liberty Wiki. It's kind of a little project we just started, trying to get a voluntarist content where, somebody who might be thinking maybe they still advocate limited government, maybe they want to go here to learn kind of what voluntarism is about. And, it's set up like a wiki, so if you see certain things that you want to click on that you want to learn more about, it's easy to do that. So
one-stop shopping for research. There you go. That's
right.
The goal.
If you ever find yourself on Wikipedia for hours just clicking links, well, hopefully you can do that on this as well.
Yeah, we're looking for moderators and contributors and stuff for that.
Yeah, so if you're a voluntarist and you like what we do and you're well versed in voluntarism, well, we could use people like you to help add content because we just started it. So
yeah, if you're interested in that, guys, send us an email at the Seeds of Liberty podcast at gmail.com, or look us up on Facebook, our Seeds of Liberty group. It's open to request and join. If you'd like to be involved with that. I know Chris, Jeremy, and Danilo and myself were all involved in that group. That's where we pull a lot of these ideas and stuff that people want to talk about from. So yeah, just search that on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. Follow Chris on Twitter at Sith Wampa, WAMPA.
Sith_Wampa, yeah.
Yeah, _Wampa. You can follow Jeremy at Abolitionist J, and our best pal, the flavor saver himself, Danilo, at P Anarchism.
Yeah.
And you can follow me at Seeds of Liberty. I have enough followers on my account. I don't care.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for awesome conversation. So you can, by the way, if any of the listeners are willing to donate some fiat, gold, silver, Bitcoin, Dogecoin. Well, no, we don't have Dogecoin, right?
No, I don't want Dogecoin.
Donation up.
You can donate to the wiki and Dogecoin.
If you can find a way to send us value, we will most assuredly take it. So
yeah, podcast hosting isn't free, guys, and we've got big plans. We got 5 shows we want to start up weekly, and that's going to cost a lot to host. So if you can even donate $1 a month, that would be awesome, to the PayPal or to the Bitcoin account.
Bitcoin.
Yep.
Or use our Amazon Associates link. All you have to do is click it, and that's easy.
Yes, we do prefer Bitcoin, but we are not ashamed to take anything else you're willing to pass our way.
I will set you up.
Yeah, we're going to do an episode on Bitcoin later down the road, and you can come on if you want and talk about that, Chris. I know you're very passionate about that idea. I actually just bought 50 American petrodollars worth of Bitcoin today, and all I can do is laugh at Coinbase as the suckers to take that money.
Right. I bought a bunch yesterday myself.
Well, awesome. Very good. Thank you very much, everyone. So this is the Seeds of Liberty podcast. Wishing everyone have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye.
Peace.
Thank you guys for listening.